The wagon wheels groaned against the rutted trail as Clara Mitchell urged her old mare forward, squinting through the dust-laden wind that swept across the vast Wyoming territory. The sun hung low on the horizon, painting the sky in violent shades of crimson and amber, as if the heavens themselves were bleeding into the parched earth below. She pulled her worn shawl tighter around her shoulders, though it did little to ward off the bite of the evening wind that carried with it the scent of sagebrush and distant rain that would never reach this forsaken stretch of land. It had been 3 months since Thomas died, 3 months since the logging accident that left her a widow at 24, with nothing but a few dollars, a stubborn mare named Buttercup, and a fierce determination to survive on her own terms. The bank had taken their small cabin near Cheyenne, and pride had kept her from returning to her sister's house in Missouri, where pitying looks and whispered gossip would have smothered her worse than any prairie dust storm. The advertisement in the Cheyenne Daily Leader had been brief. Cook needed, Rocking M Ranch, room, board, fair wages, no questions asked. It was the last part that had decided her, in a territory where a woman alone was either pitied or suspected. No questions asked sounded like salvation. As Buttercup crested the final ridge, Clara caught her first glimpse of the Rocking M Ranch spread out in the valley below. It wasn't much to look at, a collection of weathered buildings huddled against the base of the mountain range like they were seeking shelter from the endless sky. The main house stood apart, its unpainted boards silvered by years of sun and storm. A bunkhouse stretched long and low to the east, smoke already rising from its chimney. Corrals held a shifting mass of cattle and horses, their calls carried on the wind. She guided Buttercup down the slope, noting how the mountains rose up behind the ranch like ancient sentinels, their faces scarred by wind and time. These weren't the gentle, rolling hills of Missouri. These mountains were harsh and unforgiving, their peaks already dusted with early snow, though it was only October. A group of men emerged from the bunkhouse as she approached, drawn by the unusual sight of a woman driving alone into their isolated world. Clara kept her chin high and her hands steady on the reins. Though her heart hammered against her ribs, she counted 8 of them, rough men with faces weathered dark as leather, their clothes bearing the dust and sweat of hard labor. They watched her with a mixture of curiosity and wariness, like she was some exotic bird blown off course by the wind. "You the cook?" The speaker was a grizzled man in his 50s, with a gray beard that hadn't seen a barber in months. His voice carried the authority of a foreman. "I am," Clara replied. Pleased, her voice came out steady. "Clara Mitchell, Jim Patterson," he said with a nod. "Foreman here, wasn't expecting—" He gestured vaguely at her, and Clara knew what he meant. Wasn't expecting a woman so young, so alone. "I can cook," she said simply. "That's what your advertisement asked for?" A younger man with sandy hair and an easy grin stepped forward. "Don't mind Patterson, ma'am. He ain't used to anything prettier than cattle showing up here. I'm Sam Hughes." He tipped his hat, and, despite everything, Clara found a small smile tugging at her lips. Patterson shot Sam a dark look before turning back to Clara. "Kitchen's through there." He pointed to a door at the side of the main house. "You'll have the room off the back. Breakfast is at 4:30 sharp, dinner at noon, supper when the work's done. 30 men to feed when we're at full strength, though we're down to 20 right now." Clara nodded, committing it all to memory. As the men began to disperse, she heard one mutter to another. "How long you reckon before she runs back to wherever she came from?" "Week at most," came the reply. "This ain't no place for a woman alone." She pretended not to hear, focusing instead on unhitching Buttercup and gathering her few possessions. Sam stayed behind to help, chattering about the ranch and the men and which one snored the loudest. Clara was grateful for his easy manner, even as she noticed Patterson watching from the bunkhouse door with an unreadable expression. The kitchen was larger than she'd expected, dominated by a massive cast-iron stove that radiated warmth into the cooling evening. Shelves lined the walls, stocked with sacks of flour, beans, salt pork, and other staples. A long wooden table scarred by years of use took up the center of the room. It was rough but clean, and Clara felt some of the tension ease from her shoulders. Her room was small but private, with a narrow bed, a washstand, and a single window that looked out toward the mountains. She set her mother's Bible on the small shelf and hung her 2 dresses on pegs by the door. It wasn't much, but it was hers for now. By the time she had the stove stoked and coffee brewing for supper, the sun had fully set, leaving only a faint glow along the mountain ridges. She lit the oil lamps and set about making biscuits and beans with salt pork simple fare, but filling. As she worked, the familiar rhythm of cooking soothed her jangled nerves. The men filed in as she was pulling the last pan of biscuits from the oven, their boots thundering on the plank floor. They took their seats with a minimum of talk, watching her with sideways glances as she set out the food. The silence stretched uncomfortable and thick until Sam spoke up. "So, Mrs. Mitchell, where'd you learn to cook?" "My mother," Clara replied, grateful for the question. "And 3 younger brothers who could eat their weight in biscuits." That drew a few chuckles, and the tension eased slightly. As the men began to eat, the room filled with the comfortable sounds of a meal, the clink of forks on tin plates, the splash of coffee being poured, quiet murmurs of appreciation for the hot food. "Better than old Pete's cooking already," one of the younger hands said, earning a round of agreement. "What happened to old Pete?" Clara asked. The room went quiet again, and she immediately regretted the question. Finally, Patterson spoke. "Took sick last month. Went to town and didn't come back." There was more to that story. Clara could tell, but she didn't push. Instead, she busied herself refilling coffee cups, learning the men's names as they gradually began to talk among themselves. There was Jake, the blacksmith with arms like tree trunks, Miguel, who handled the remuda with gentle expertise, the Williams brothers, Tom and Henry, barely out of their teens, and others whose names she'd learn in time. As she moved around the table, one of the men started telling a story about a stranger who'd been seen riding the mountain trails at odd hours. "Tall fellow, rides a black horse," Jake was saying. "Seen him twice now, just at dusk. Never comes close enough to hail. Probably just a drifter," Patterson said, but Clara noticed he looked troubled. "Or could be one of them outlaws from the Sweetwater country," Tom Williams suggested eagerly. "Heard tell there's been trouble up that way. Could be anyone," Sam said reasonably. "Mountains are full of men who don't want to be found." Clara was clearing the last of the plates when she heard it. The sound of hoofbeats, slow and measured, passing by the kitchen window. She glanced out but saw only darkness and her own reflection in the glass. When she turned back, several of the men had their hands near their sidearms. "Just a rider passing through," Patterson said. But he moved to the door and peered out into the night. After a moment, he closed it and returned to his seat. Nothing there, but Clara had seen the look that passed between him and Jake. Whoever the stranger was, he made these tough men nervous, and that made her nervous too. After the men filed out, Clara washed dishes in water heated on the stove, her hands working automatically while her mind wandered. The kitchen was quiet now, except for the pop of wood in the stove and the distant lowing of cattle. Through the window, she could see the bunkhouse lights and hear the faint sound of a harmonica, one of the men playing a lonesome tune that seemed to capture all the isolation of this place. She was banking the stove for the night when she heard the hoofbeats again, closer this time. Moving to the window, she peered out into the darkness. For just a moment, illuminated by the spillage of light from the kitchen, she saw him, a lone rider on a black horse, his hat pulled low, sitting still as a statue just at the edge of the light. She couldn't see his face, but she felt his gaze on her, intense and unsettling. Then he touched his hat brim, a gesture that might have been greeting or warning, and melted back into the darkness. Clara stood frozen at the window, heart racing, until the sound of hoofbeats faded into the night. She checked the door locks twice before retiring to her small room, where she lay awake, listening to the unfamiliar sounds of the ranch settling for the night. Somewhere, in the distance, a coyote howled, and its packmates answered. their cries echoing off the mountains. The wind rattled her window and whispered through the gaps in the walls, carrying with it all the loneliness and danger of this untamed land. Clara pulled her quilt up to her chin and closed her eyes, trying not to think about the rider in the darkness or the way the men's faces had tightened at mention of him. She'd come here seeking a new start, a chance to forge her own path without the weight of pity or charity. But as sleep finally claimed her, she couldn't shake the feeling that she'd traded one set of troubles for another, and that the stranger on the black horse was only the beginning. The rhythm of ranch life settled over Clara like a well-worn blanket, familiar in its demands, even if the setting was foreign. She rose each morning in the pre-dawn darkness, her breath misting in the cold air as she dressed quickly and made her way to the kitchen. The stove, still warm from the banked coals, would roar back to life under her practiced hands, and soon the smell of coffee and biscuits would drift through the ranch buildings, calling the men from their bunks. 2 weeks had passed since her arrival, and she'd learned the preferences of each man who liked their eggs runny, who took 3 sugars in their coffee, who always reached for seconds of her cornbread. The work was hard, her hands already bearing new calluses from kneading bread and hauling water, but there was satisfaction in feeding men who worked themselves to exhaustion under the vast Wyoming sky. She'd also learned to read the weather like the cowboys did. This morning, the air had a different quality, thick and oppressive despite the October chill. To the west, clouds piled up against the mountains like gray wool, and the wind carried the metallic scent of coming storm. "Dust storm brewing," Patterson announced at breakfast. His weathered face creased with concern. "We'll need to get the stock moved to the sheltered pastures." The men ate hurriedly, tension crackling through the room. Clara had heard about the dust storms that could sweep across the plains, choking man and beast alike, but she'd never experienced one. As she cleared plates, Sam caught her eye. "You'll want to seal up the windows best you can, ma'am," he advised. "Use wet rags if you got 'em. That dust gets into everything." By noon, the western sky had turned an ominous yellow-brown, and the wind had picked up to a steady moan. Clara worked quickly to prepare a cold supper the men could eat later. The stove would make the kitchen unbearable once the storm hit and the windows were sealed. She filled every available container with water and wetted down flour sacks to stuff around the window frames. She was struggling to secure a particularly stubborn shutter when the wind suddenly gusted, nearly tearing it from her hands. The heavy wood slammed back against the wall with enough force to knock her off balance. As she fought to regain control, strong hands reached over hers, grabbing the shutter and pulling it closed. Clara spun around to find herself face to face with a stranger, tall and lean, with dark hair showing beneath his hat brim and eyes the color of winter steel. He wore the rough clothes of a drifter, but something in his bearing suggested he was no ordinary saddle tramp. This had to be the mysterious rider the men had spoken of. "Storm's coming fast," he said, his voice low and measured. "This latch is broken." He produced a length of rope from somewhere and quickly secured the shutter. "That should hold." Clara found her voice. "Thank you, but who—" "Kitchen door's banging," he interrupted, already moving away. "Better see to it." She hurried after him, finding the door indeed threatening to tear loose in the rising wind. Together they wrestled it closed, and he slid the heavy bar into place. The sudden quiet was almost oppressive after the howling wind. "I don't believe we've met," Clara said, trying to regain some semblance of propriety despite her racing heart. A ghost of a smile touched his lips. "No, ma'am, we haven't." He touched his hat brim. "I'll be going now. Storm's almost here." "Going? You can't ride in this." But he was already at the door, lifting the bar. "I've got shelter," he said. "You keep inside until it passes." Then he was gone, the door slamming shut behind him. Clara stood frozen for a moment, then rushed to the window. Through the last clear patch of air, she saw him mounting the black horse, his movements swift and sure despite the wind trying to knock him down. He rode not toward town or the bunkhouse, but up toward the mountains, disappearing into the approaching wall of dust. The storm hit moments later with a fury that made Clara gasp. The house shook under the assault, dust forcing its way through every tiny gap despite her preparations. The world outside the windows turned black as night, filled with a roaring that sounded like a freight train bearing down on them. Clara lit lamps and tried to keep the worst of the dust out of the food stores, covering everything with clean cloths. The hours crawled by, marked only by the steady tick of the kitchen clock that somehow could be heard over the storm's rage. She found herself thinking about the stranger, wondering where he'd found shelter in those unforgiving mountains. When the storm finally began to ease near sunset, the world it revealed was transformed. Dust coated everything in a fine layer of brown, drifts of it piled against buildings like snow. The men straggled in throughout the evening, exhausted and caked with dirt, their eyes red-rimmed above the bandanas they'd used to cover their faces. "Lost 2 calves," Patterson reported grimly as Clara served what supper she could manage. "Could have been worse." "Anyone see that drifter during the storm?" Jake asked, and Clara's hand stilled on the coffee pot. "What drifter?" Patterson's voice was sharp. "Saw him heading up Elk Trail right before it hit." One of the younger hands said, "That black horse of his, crazy fool riding into that. There's an old line shack up that way." Miguel offered. "If he knew about it, he might have made it." Clara kept her silence about the stranger's visit, some instinct warning her that Patterson wouldn't approve. She served the men and listened to their tired conversation, but her thoughts kept returning to those steady gray eyes and the sure way he'd handled the shutters. That night, as she cleaned up the kitchen still gritty with dust, she found herself watching the darkness beyond the windows. Somewhere up in those mountains, the stranger had weathered the storm. The thought shouldn't have mattered to her. Drifters came and went all the time in this country, but she couldn't forget the brief moment when he'd smiled, or the way he'd simply appeared when she needed help, like some guardian angel in worn leather and trail dust. The next morning dawned clear and cold, the mountains etched sharp against a sky washed clean by the storm. As Clara scattered feed for the chickens, she noticed fresh hoof prints in the dust near the kitchen door, prints that hadn't been there the night before. On the doorstep sat a bundle wrapped in oilcloth. Inside, she found a haunch of fresh venison, cleanly butchered and wrapped in clean cloth. No note, no message, but Clara knew who had left it. She stood holding the meat, feeling something shift inside her chest, a warming that had nothing to do with the morning sun. "Where'd that come from?" Patterson's voice made her jump. He stood in the doorway, his expression suspicious. "Found it on the step," Clara said, which was true enough. "Fresh meat will be welcome after all the salt pork." Patterson's eyes narrowed, but he just nodded. "That stranger's been leaving game at the line shacks too. Tom Williams found a dressed antelope at the north shack last week." He paused, studying her face. "You see anyone around here?" "No," Clara lied smoothly, surprised at herself. "Must have come during the night?" Patterson grunted and left, but Clara caught him glancing back at her with a measuring look. She busied herself with preparing the venison, trying to ignore the flutter in her stomach that came from protecting the stranger's secret. As she worked, she found herself humming, something she hadn't done since Thomas died. The meat was perfectly field-dressed, showing skill and care. Whoever the stranger was, he knew his way around the wilderness, and for reasons she couldn't explain, he was watching over the ranch. Sam came in mid-morning for coffee and gossip, as was becoming his habit. "You seem cheerful today, Mrs. Mitchell," he observed, accepting a cup with grateful hands. "The storm's passed," Clara said simply. "And we have fresh meat for dinner." You found the mystery man's gift." Sam grinned at her surprise. "Not much stays secret on a ranch, ma'am, though I notice you didn't mention seeing anyone to Patterson." Clara felt heat rise in her cheeks. "I didn't see anyone," she maintained. "Course not," Sam agreed easily. "Just like none of us have seen him watering his horse at the creek some evenings, or checking the fence lines we haven't had time to ride." He took a long sip of coffee. "Whoever he is, he seems to mean no harm. Maybe even some good." After Sam left, Clara stood at the window watching the men work with the horses in the corral. Her life had taken so many unexpected turns, from a happy bride to a grieving widow to a cook on an isolated ranch. Now this stranger had appeared, bringing with him a mystery that made her pulse quicken and her thoughts wander. She pressed a hand to her chest, feeling the steady beat of her heart. Just loneliness, she told herself firmly. Nothing more. But that night, as she banked the stove and prepared for bed, she couldn't help but leave a plate of food covered on the back step, when she found it gone in the morning, replaced by a small bundle of sage and wildflowers tied with a strand of sweetgrass. She held them to her face and breathed deep, allowing herself just a moment to wonder what kind of man left flowers for a woman he'd barely spoken to. The stranger had become part of the rhythm of her days, invisible but somehow present, like the mountains that watched over them all. And despite the danger he might represent, despite Patterson's suspicions and the uncertainty of it all, Clara found herself looking forward to each small sign of his presence, each gift that appeared like magic from the vast Wyoming night. November arrived with teeth, bringing the first real blizzard of the season howling down from the mountains. Clara woke to a world transformed, snow piled high against the windows, the familiar landscape erased beneath a blanket of white. The temperature had plummeted overnight, and ice crystals formed on her breath as she hurried to start the kitchen stove. The men stumbled in for breakfast looking haggard, having spent half the night moving cattle to shelter. Patterson's face was grim as he accepted his coffee with hands still stiff from cold. "Lost the supply wagon coming from town," he announced. "Driver turned back when the storm hit. We'll have to make do with what we've got until the road's clear." Clara mentally inventoried her stores. They had beans and salt pork aplenty, but flour was running low. And coffee, the lifeblood of any ranch, wouldn't last more than a week at the rate these men drank it. "How long before the roads are passable?" she asked. "Could be days, could be weeks," Jake answered, warming his massive hands around his cup. "Depends on if this weather breaks." But the weather didn't break. For 3 days, snow fell steadily, piling up in drifts that reached the eaves of the lower buildings. The men worked in shifts, keeping paths clear to the essential buildings and checking on the stock. But it was a losing battle against the relentless storm. On the third night, Clara was rationing out the last of the good flour for morning biscuits when she heard it. A soft knock at the kitchen door, barely audible above the wind. Her heart jumped, but she forced herself to move calmly to the door. "Who's there?" "A friend." The voice was low, familiar. Clara lifted the bar and opened the door to a swirl of snow and the stranger, looking like a creature made of winter itself. Ice crusted his coat and hat, and his face was pale with cold above the scarf wrapped around his lower face. But he was carrying 2 heavy sacks that made Clara's eyes widen. "Quickly," she said, stepping aside. He entered, stomping snow from his boots, and set the sacks on the table. "Flour," he said, indicating one. "And coffee, sugar, some other supplies in the second." Where did you?" Clara stammered, astonished. "There's an old trading post up the mountain. Finnish man runs it. Doesn't ask questions if you pay in gold." He unwrapped the scarf, revealing a face more weathered than she'd realized in their brief previous encounter. "Figured you might be running low." We were." Clara found herself staring at him, this mysterious benefactor who appeared from storms bearing gifts. "You could have died trying to get through this weather." Something flickered in his gray eyes. Amusement, perhaps. "I've survived worse." He glanced around the empty kitchen. "The men?" "In the bunkhouse. It's past midnight." Clara suddenly realized the impropriety of being alone with him, but couldn't bring herself to care. "You must be frozen. Let me get you some coffee." "I shouldn't stay." "Nonsense. You'll at least warm up before going back out in that." She was already pouring from the pot she always kept warm on the stove. "Sit." He hesitated, then sank into a chair with a quiet groan that suggested he was more exhausted than he'd let on. Clara set the cup before him and noticed his hands shaking slightly as he wrapped them around it. "How long were you out there?" she asked softly. "Left this morning. Storm caught me on the way back." He took a long sip, and color began returning to his face. Worth it, though. You can't make decent biscuits without good flour. Clara felt a smile tugging at her lips. You've been watching close enough to know about my biscuits. This time, the flicker in his eyes was definitely amusement. Ma'am, every man within 20 miles knows about your biscuits. Tom Williams was bragging about them in the saloon last week. They sat in comfortable silence for a moment, the storm howling outside, making the warm kitchen feel like a sanctuary. Clara found herself studying his face, strong features marked by sun and weather, a thin scar along his jaw, eyes that seemed to hold depths of experience and sadness. "What's your name?" she asked suddenly. "I can't keep thinking of you as the stranger." He was quiet so long she thought he wouldn't answer. Finally, Nathan Holloway. "Clara Mitchell," she offered, though she suspected he already knew. "What brings you to these mountains, Mr. Holloway?" "Just Nathan." He stared into his coffee. "And it's more what keeps me here. These mountains, they don't judge a man by his past, only by how he treats the land and the people on it." There was a story there. Clara could tell, but she didn't push. She understood about pasts that were better left buried. "My husband died 3 months ago," she found herself saying instead. "Logging accident. I came here because I couldn't stand the pity, the way everyone looked at me like I was broken." Nathan's eyes met hers, and she saw understanding there. "You're not broken. Takes strength to start over, especially out here. Some days I wonder." Clara wrapped her hands around her own cup. "This land is so different from home. Harder, lonelier, but freer," Nathan said quietly. "No one telling you how to grieve or how to live. Just you in the sky and the choice of what to do with each day." Clara felt tears prick her eyes at his words. The first understanding she'd encountered since Thomas's death that didn't come wrapped in platitudes or expectations. "The men don't trust you," she said, changing the subject before the emotions overwhelmed her. "They think you might be an outlaw." Nathan's mouth quirked. "They're not entirely wrong. I've been on both sides of the law, depending on whose law you're talking about." He set down his cup. "But I mean no harm to the Rocking M or anyone on it. This place—" He paused, seeming to search for words. "It reminds me of somewhere I used to know. Somewhere I lost." Before Clara could ask what he meant, he stood abruptly. "I should go. The storm's easing." She followed him to the door, not wanting him to leave, but knowing he must. As he rewrapped his scarf, she touched his sleeve. "Thank you. For the supplies. For—" She gestured helplessly, unable to articulate what his understanding meant. He covered her hand with his briefly, the touch warm despite his cold gloves. "There's a line shack about 2 miles up Elk Trail. If you ever need help, if there's trouble, hang a red cloth from the kitchen window. I'll see it." Then he was gone, swallowed by the swirling snow, leaving Clara standing in the doorway until the cold drove her back inside. She barred the door and leaned against it, heart racing from more than the chill. The next morning, Patterson's sharp eyes immediately spotted the new supplies. "Where'd these come from?" His tone was suspicious. "Found them on the step this morning," Clara said, the lie coming easier now. "Must be from our benefactor." Patterson's jaw tightened. This stranger's taking a mighty keen interest in our welfare. Makes a man wonder what he wants in return. "Maybe he just wants to help," Sam suggested. But Patterson shot him a dark look. "Nobody helps for free. There's always a price." He turned back to Clara. "You see him again. You tell me immediately. Understood." Clara nodded, but her fingers were crossed in the folds of her apron. She served breakfast and listened to the men talk, but her thoughts kept drifting to the line shack up Elk Trail and the man who waited there like some guardian spirit of the mountains. That evening, as she cleaned up after supper, she found herself humming again, an old hymn her mother used to sing while cooking. Outside, the storm had finally broken, leaving the world crystalline and sharp under a clear sky. Stars emerged one by one, bright as lanterns in the cold air. She thought about what Nathan had said about freedom, about choosing what to do with each day. For the first time since Thomas's death, she felt something besides grief and determination. It was fragile, this new feeling, like the first green shoots pushing through snow. But it was there, warmed by the memory of understanding in gray eyes and the knowledge that someone was watching over her in this harsh land. Before she went to bed, she pulled out a piece of red cloth from her sewing basket, part of an old petticoat she'd been meaning to mend. She folded it carefully and placed it on the shelf by the window, just in case. Not because she needed help, she told herself, but because it was good to know it was there, like Nathan himself, a presence in the mountains, asking nothing, offering kindness in a world that had precious little of it to spare. That night, she dreamed of spring coming to the mountains, of wildflowers blooming where snow now lay deep, and of gray eyes that held promises unspoken but somehow understood. When she woke to start another day's work, she found herself looking forward to it in a way she hadn't in months, carrying with her the warmth of connection found in the midst of a winter storm. The trouble started on a cold December morning when 3 riders appeared on the ridge above the ranch. Clara spotted them first as she scattered feed for the chickens, dark silhouettes against the pale winter sky, sitting their horses with the stillness of men watching and waiting. "Mr. Patterson," she called quietly, not taking her eyes off the riders. The foreman emerged from the barn, following her gaze. His expression darkened. "Get inside," he ordered. "Now." Clara retreated to the kitchen but positioned herself where she could see through the window. Patterson and several hands were gathering in the yard, rifles held casual but ready. The riders began their descent, and as they drew closer, Clara could see they were rough-looking men, trail-worn and hard-eyed. "Looking for strays," the lead rider called out when they were within speaking distance. He was a thick-set man with a scar pulling down one corner of his mouth. "Lost some cattle in that last storm." "Haven't seen any strays wearing your brand," Patterson replied evenly. "What outfit you riding for?" "Ourselves," Scarface said with a grin that held no humor. "Small operation north of here. Name's Bates. These are my associates, Crocker and Morse." Clara memorized the names and faces. Crocker thin and nervous-looking, Morse silent with dead eyes that made her shiver. These weren't ordinary cowboys, she was certain. "Well, Mr. Bates, you're welcome to water your horses, but then I'll ask you to move on," Patterson said. "This is private property. Hospitable folks," Bates observed, his gaze sliding past Patterson to the house. Clara stepped back from the window, but not before those cold eyes found her. "That your woman in there?" "The cook," Patterson said curtly. "And none of your concern. Pretty thing to be way out here alone," Bates continued, still staring at the house. "Dangerous country for a woman." The tension in the yard ratcheted up several notches. Clara saw Jake's hand drift toward his sidearm, and Sam had positioned himself near the rifle propped against the fence. "Time for you to go," Patterson said. All pretense of civility gone. Bates held his stare for a long moment, then laughed. Sure. No offense meant. We'll just have a look around for our strays and be on our way." They rode out slowly, making a show of examining the cattle in the near pasture. But Clara noticed how their eyes kept returning to the buildings, noting positions, counting men. After they finally disappeared over the ridge, the ranch hands remained tense and watchful. "Double the night watch," Patterson ordered. "And someone stays close to the house at all times." That evening, Clara found the men unusually quiet at supper. Finally. Young Tom Williams voiced what they were all thinking. Those weren't cowboys. They were sizing us up. Rustlers, most like. Jake agreed. Testing to see how many guns we got. 20 men should be enough to discourage them, Miguel said. But he sounded uncertain. Unless they come at night, someone muttered. Clara served coffee with hands that trembled slightly. The warm kitchen that had become her sanctuary suddenly felt vulnerable, its windows dark mouths that anyone could peer through. When the men filed out, Sam lingered. "You'll be all right. Mrs. Mitchell. We won't let anything happen to you." She managed a smile. "I know. Thank you, Sam." But after he left, she found herself checking the door locks repeatedly and jumping at every sound. Around midnight, unable to sleep, she sat at the kitchen table with her mother's Bible, trying to find comfort in familiar words. That's when she heard it. Soft footsteps on the porch. Too quiet to be one of the ranch hands. Her heart hammered as the footsteps paused at the door. Then came a soft knock. 3 taps, a pause, then 2 more. Relief flooded through her. She didn't know how she knew, but she was certain it was Nathan. She opened the door to find him standing there, concern etched on his weathered face. "Saw the riders earlier," he said without preamble. "Recognized Bates. He's bad news, runs with a gang that's been hitting ranches north of here. Patterson thinks they'll come back." "They will." Nathan stepped inside at her gesture, his presence immediately making the kitchen feel safer. "Probably in the next few nights, while they think you're scared and off balance." "We are scared," Clara admitted, wrapping her arms around herself. Nathan's expression softened. "Fear's not bad if it keeps you sharp. It's panic that gets people killed." He moved to the window, studying the yard. "Your men are good, but they're cowboys, not gunfighters. Bates's gang is used to violence. What should we do?" "Be ready." He turned back to her. "And maybe let them know you're not as unprotected as they think." 2 nights later, Clara was startled awake by shouting and the thunder of hooves. She threw on her wrapper and rushed to the window to see chaos in the yard. Riders wheeling through the darkness. Gunfire erupting in sharp bursts. Men running for cover. The raiders had come in force, at least a dozen of them, hitting the ranch from multiple directions. Clara saw Bates directing his men, trying to drive off the horses while others headed for the cattle. She was reaching for the red cloth when the kitchen door exploded inward. Crocker stood there, gun in hand, his nervous face split by an ugly grin. Well, the pretty cook, all alone." Clara backed away, her hand searching behind her for a weapon. Finding the heavy iron skillet. "The men are busy." Crocker advanced on her. "Bates said I could have first." The shot came from behind Clara, the sound deafening in the enclosed space. Crocker spun and fell, clutching his shoulder. Nathan stepped through the back door, his gun still smoking. "You all right?" he asked Clara, not taking his eyes off the wounded man. She nodded, unable to speak, still clutching the skillet. "Good, stay behind me." Nathan moved toward the front door, then stopped as Bates himself appeared, gun drawn. "Well now," Bates said, taking in the scene. "Nathan Holloway. Heard you were dead." "Disappointed to disappoint you, Bates. Boys said they'd seen you skulking around. Didn't believe them." Bates's scarred face twisted. "You killed my brother 2 years back. Your brother was robbing a stage full of families. Had it coming." The 2 men faced each other across the kitchen, guns steady. Clara held her breath, acutely aware that she was standing between 2 dangerous men with history written in blood. "This isn't your fight, Holloway." Bates said, "Walk away now, and we'll settle up another time. Made it my fight when you threatened this place." Nathan's voice was calm, almost conversational. "And the lady—" Bates's eyes flicked to Clara. "That how it is? Nathan Holloway gone soft over a woman? The only soft thing here is your head if you think I'll let you ride out of here." Nathan shifted slightly, and Clara saw his muscles coil. "Tell your men to stand down, or I start with you and work my way through them." For a moment, the kitchen was silent except for Crocker's whimpering. Then, from outside, came Patterson's voice, strong and clear. "Ranch is secured, boys. Round up these rustlers." Bates's face showed he understood. The raid had failed. His men were scattered or captured. He'd gambled and lost. "This isn't over. Holloway!" He snarled, but he was already backing toward the door. "Yes," Nathan said quietly. "It is." Bates turned to flee, but Nathan's shot caught him in the leg, sending him sprawling in the dooryard. Within moments, Patterson and the hands had him secured along with several other captured raiders. As the chaos settled and dawn approached, Clara found herself standing in the kitchen doorway, watching Nathan talk quietly with Patterson. The foreman's attitude had completely changed. He was listening intently, nodding, even shaking Nathan's hand. Sam appeared at her elbow. "Turns out your mysterious stranger is quite the known quantity. Former territorial marshal, they say, cleaned up some of the worst gangs before—" He paused. "Well, before something happened that made him hang up his badge." Nathan approached them, and Sam discreetly withdrew. In the growing light, Clara could see a graze on Nathan's cheek where a bullet had come too close. "You're hurt," she said, reaching up instinctively to touch the wound. He caught her hand gently. "I've had worse." His gray eyes searched hers. "You were brave in there. Not many would have kept their head with Crocker coming at them." "I was terrified," Clara confessed. "But you didn't panic. There's a difference." He squeezed her hand before releasing it. "I should go. The territorial marshal will want to question me about Bates. And I'd rather not." "You saved us," Clara interrupted. "Saved me? How can I thank you?" A ghost of his rare smile appeared. "You already have. Every meal you cook, every moment of normalcy you bring to this place, that's thanks enough." He started to turn away, but Clara caught his sleeve. "Nathan, wait, what Sam said about you being a marshal?" "Was," Nathan corrected. "That life's behind me now." "What happened?" He was quiet for so long she thought he wouldn't answer. Then, softly, "I lost my family, wife, daughter, to men like Bates, while I was off upholding the law somewhere else." His jaw tightened. "Learned that day that all the badges and laws in the world can't protect what matters most. So I threw it away. Came here to the mountains to—" He shrugged. "To forget, I suppose, or at least to stop remembering so sharp." Clara's heart ached for the pain in his voice. Without thinking, she stepped closer and placed her hand on his chest, feeling his heartbeat strong beneath her palm. "I'm sorry." He covered her hand with his, and for a moment they stood frozen in the doorway, the morning light painting the mountains gold behind them. Then Nathan stepped back, his walls rebuilding. "Take care, Clara," he said, and walked away toward his waiting horse. Clara watched him go, her hand still warm from his touch, her heart full of new understanding. The mysterious stranger had a name, a past, a grief that matched her own. And despite his walls, despite the danger that seemed to follow him, she knew with sudden certainty that their stories had become entwined, like two streams converging in the mountain valleys. Behind her, the ranch was coming back to life, men talking excitedly about the night's events. But Clara stood in the doorway a moment longer, watching Nathan's figure grow small against the vastness of the mountains, carrying with her the memory of his heartbeat beneath her hand and the promise implicit in his farewell. Not goodbye, just take care. As if he'd be watching still, her guardian in the shadows, bound by something deeper than duty or chance. The territorial official arrived on a gray January morning, his black coat and stern demeanor as out of place on the ranch as a parlor chair in a barn. Mr. Josiah Whitman, Land Commissioner, carried with him a leather portfolio thick with documents and an air of bureaucratic authority that immediately set everyone on edge. Clara watched from the kitchen window as Patterson greeted the man, their conversation growing visibly tense. When they headed toward the main house, she quickly smoothed her apron and put coffee on to brew, sensing this visit would require hospitality despite its ominous feel. "Mrs. Mitchell," Patterson said as they entered, his weathered face carefully neutral. "This is Mr. Whitman from the territorial office. He needs to speak with you about the ranch." "Ma'am?" Whitman nodded curtly, settling himself at the kitchen table and spreading out his papers. "I'll come straight to the point. There's been some question about the ownership of this property." Clara's hand stilled on the coffee pot. "What kind of question?" "The Rockingham Ranch comprises nearly 20,000 acres of prime grazing land," Whitman began, consulting his documents. "The original deed was filed by one Josiah Morgan in 1867. Mr. Morgan died without clear heirs. and the property has been, shall we say, informally managed since then. We've been running this ranch for near 15 years. Patterson interjected. Mr. Morgan's partner, Jim Stockton, took over operations. Without legal documentation. Whitman interrupted. Mr. Stockton himself passed 5 years ago, leaving the situation even more unclear. The territory has been patient, but with statehood on the horizon, all land titles must be properly settled. Clara poured coffee with steady hands, though her mind was racing. What does this mean for the ranch, for the men who work here? That remains to be seen, Whitman said, accepting his cup without thanks. The territory is prepared to auction the land to the highest bidder, unless, he paused dramatically, unless the rightful heir can be located and chooses to claim the property. Morgan had no family, Patterson said flatly. Everyone knows that. On the contrary, Whitman produced another document. Our research indicates Mr. Morgan had a son, though they were estranged. The boy left home young, had some trouble with the law. But blood is blood, and legal inheritance follows bloodlines. Clara felt a chill that had nothing to do with the winter air seeping through the walls. You found this son? We have reason to believe he may be in the area, Whitman said carefully. Going by another name, perhaps the territory has authorized me to remain here until the matter is resolved. One way or another, the Rocking M will have a legal owner within the month. After Whitman left to inspect the property boundaries, Clara found Patterson slumped at the table, looking every one of his 50-odd years. 15 years I've run this place, he said quietly, through droughts and blizzards, Indian troubles and rustlers. Now some paper pusher tells me it might all be sold to the highest bidder. There must be something we can do, Clara said, though she couldn't imagine what. Patterson's laugh was bitter. What? Pool our wages to outbid some Eastern cattle company? They've been circling like vultures, waiting for chances like this. He stood heavily. I need to tell the men. Some of them have families in town, homes. They'll need time to make plans. That evening, the bunkhouse was subdued despite Clara's effort to make a special dinner. The men picked at their food, talking in low voices about where they might find work, whether other ranches were hiring. Sam tried to keep spirits up with jokes and stories, but even he seemed deflated. Clara retreated to her kitchen after dinner, mechanically cleaning dishes while her thoughts churned. This place had become her sanctuary, her chance at independence. The thought of losing it, of having to start over again somewhere else, made her chest tight with panic. She was so lost in thought that she didn't hear the soft knock at first. When it came again, she opened the door to find Nathan standing in the moonlight, his face grave. I heard about Whitman, he said without preamble. The whole valley's talking about it. Come in, Clara said, too weary and worried to care about propriety. Coffee's still warm. They sat at the table where hours earlier Whitman had spread his documents like a merchant displaying wares. Nathan listened quietly as Clara explained the situation, his expression growing more shuttered with each detail. Morgan's son, he said finally, staring into his coffee. Whitman say what name he might be using? No, just that he might be in the area. Clara studied Nathan's face, noting the tension in his jaw. Nathan, do you know something about this? He was quiet for so long she thought he wouldn't answer. Then he stood abruptly and moved to the window, looking out at the moonlit ranch. My name is Nathan Holloway now, he said quietly. But I was born Nathan Morgan. Clara's breath caught. You're Josiah Morgan's son? His voice was flat, emotionless. That connection died long before he did. I left when I was 16, he paused. After we disagreed about everything a father and son could disagree about? He wanted me to be a rancher, carry on his legacy. I wanted to see beyond these mountains, maybe make a difference wearing a badge. But the ranch belongs to whoever wants it, Nathan interrupted harshly. I didn't come back when he was alive, didn't reconcile when I had the chance. I've got no right to it now. You have every right. Clara stood, moving toward him. You're his son, his heir. I'm the man who let him die alone." Nathan turned from the window, his gray eyes full of old pain. "Too proud to forgive, too stubborn to come home until it was too late. You think I deserve to inherit what he built with his life?" "I think," Clara said carefully, "that you've been punishing yourself long enough, and I think you care about this place more than you admit. Why else have you been watching over it? Leaving game for the men, checking fence lines, protecting us from rustlers." Nathan's smile was rueful. "You noticed all that?" "I notice everything about you," Clara said, then blushed at her boldness. They stood facing each other in the warm kitchen, the weight of unspoken things heavy between them. Finally. Nathan reached out and tucked a strand of hair behind Clara's ear, his touch infinitely gentle. "Even if I wanted to claim it, and I'm not saying I do, Whitman would need proof. Documents. I've been Nathan Holloway for so long, I doubt I could prove I was ever anyone else." "There must be something," Clara insisted. "Birth records. Someone who knew you as a child." "Clara," her name on his lips stopped her. "You don't understand. The man I was, the things I did after I left. My father would be ashamed. Better the ranch goes to someone who'll honor it proper. Someone like those Eastern cattle companies Patterson mentioned. They'll carve this place up, run off the families who depend on it." Clara's temper flared. "That's honoring your father's memory?" Nathan's jaw tightened. "It's not my choice to make." "Isn't it?" Clara challenged. "You talk about law and justice. Where's the justice in letting strangers destroy what your father built? Where's the justice for the men who've worked this land faithful for years? You don't know what you're asking," Nathan said, his voice rough. "To claim this place, I'd have to claim the name I buried, face the ghosts I've been running from." "Maybe it's time to stop running," Clara said softly. She took his hand, feeling the calluses and scars of a hard life. "Maybe that's why fate brought you back here, not to punish you, but to give you a second chance." Nathan looked down at their joined hands, his thumb brushing across her knuckles. "When I lost Mary and little Sarah, I swore I'd never care about anything again, never risk that kind of pain." His eyes met hers. "But you make me want things I thought were dead and buried." Clara's heart raced at the admission, at the raw vulnerability in his voice. "Nathan, I need time to think," he said, gently releasing her hand. "Whitman gave us a month. Less now. 3 weeks, maybe." Nathan nodded slowly. I'll think on it." He moved toward the door, then paused. "Whatever happens, Clara, know that this place, these people, you've mattered to me. More than I thought anything could matter again." Then he was gone, leaving Clara standing in the kitchen with her heart pounding and her thoughts in turmoil. Outside, clouds drifted across the moon, casting shifting shadows across the land that might soon belong to strangers, unless a prodigal son could find the courage to come home at last. She pressed her fingers to her lips, still feeling the phantom touch of his hand, and whispered a prayer to the cold night air. For Nathan, for the ranch, for the fragile hope that sometimes the past could be redeemed and broken things made whole again. The next 3 weeks would tell whether that hope had any foundation, or whether they would all scatter like seeds on the Wyoming wind, their brief season of belonging at an end. The accusations began with whispers in town. Clara first heard them when she went to buy supplies, noticing how conversation stopped when she entered the general store, how eyes followed her with suspicion rather than the usual polite interest. "Heard that drifter's been seen at the ranch regular-like. Mrs. Henderson, the banker's wife," said loudly enough for Clara to hear. "Strange how he showed up just when the Bates gang did, almost like someone told them when to strike." Clara kept her head high as she paid for her goods, but her hands trembled as she loaded the wagon. By the time she returned to the ranch, the whispers had grown to open hostility. A delegation from town arrived the next morning, 5 men led by Sheriff Watson, their faces grim with righteous purpose. Clara watched from the kitchen as they confronted Patterson in the yard. "We've had reports," the sheriff began, "that Nathan Holloway's been harboring stolen cattle up in the mountains. Some say he was working with Bates all along, playing both sides. That's nonsense, Patterson said flatly. Holloway saved this ranch from those rustlers, or made it look that way. One of the townsmen interjected. Mighty convenient, him showing up just in time. Maybe he wanted to throw suspicion off himself. Clara couldn't stand it anymore. She burst out of the kitchen, anger overcoming caution. Nathan Holloway risked his life to protect us. How dare you? Ma'am, Sheriff Watson interrupted, his eyes cold. Several people have reported seeing you with Holloway, alone, at odd hours. The implication hung in the air like smoke. Clara felt heat rise in her cheeks, but from rage, not shame. I've done nothing improper, she said firmly. Mr. Holloway has been nothing but honorable. Honorable men don't skulk in the shadows. Mrs. Henderson had joined the group, her pinched face eager with malicious gossip. And respectable widows don't entertain mysterious strangers in their kitchens after dark. The unfairness of it all made Clara want to scream. These people who had never shown her anything but cold courtesy were now ready to destroy her reputation on the basis of rumor and suspicion. That's enough. Patterson stepped forward, his weathered face hard. Mrs. Mitchell is under my protection as an employee of this ranch. You'll speak respectfully or not at all. The ranch that might not be yours much longer, Sheriff Watson asked pointedly. Interesting how Holloway appeared just when the ownership came into question. Maybe he's got his own interests in the property. After they left, with warnings about harboring fugitives and threats of further investigation, Clara found herself shaking with delayed reaction. The men gathered around, their faces showing mixture of anger and concern. Don't pay them no mind. Mrs. Mitchell, Sam said firmly. We know the truth of it. But Clara could see the doubt in some eyes. In hard times, suspicion spread like wildfire, and even good men could be swayed by persistent rumors. That night, she hung the red cloth in her window, her hands steady despite the turmoil in her heart. Nathan needed to know what was happening, needed to protect himself from the growing mob mentality in town. He came just after midnight, slipping in like a shadow. One look at her face and his expression darkened. What's happened? She told him everything, watching his jaw tighten with each word. When she finished, he was silent, staring at the floor. They're not entirely wrong, he said finally. I did work with Bates once, years ago, before I knew what he really was. It's how I recognized him that night. Clara's heart sank. Nathan, I was young, desperate, running from my father and everything this place represented. He looked up at her, eyes full of old regrets. I did things I'm not proud of, nothing like what they're accusing me of now, but enough to give their lies the ring of truth. That was the past. Clara said firmly, You're not that man anymore. Aren't I? Nathan stood abruptly, pacing the small kitchen. I'm still hiding, still running. Maybe they're right to suspect me. Stop it, Clara snapped, surprising them both with her vehemence. You saved this ranch. You saved me. That's who you are now. And look what it's cost you. Nathan gestured helplessly. Your reputation. My reputation? Clara laughed, but there was no humor in it. You think I care what those gossips think? I buried my husband, left everything I knew, came to this wilderness alone. I've already broken every rule they have for proper widows. She moved closer to him, close enough to see the pain etched in every line of his face. Don't you understand? They're doing this because they're afraid of change, afraid of losing control. If they can paint you as a villain, they can justify taking the ranch, scattering the families who depend on it. All the more reason for me to leave, Nathan said quietly. If I'm gone, they have no target. If you leave, they win. Clara interrupted. And I lose the only person who's made me feel alive since Thomas died. The admission hung between them, raw and honest. Nathan's expression shifted, vulnerability breaking through his walls. Clara, he breathed, reaching out to cup her face. You deserve better than a broken-down former lawman with more past than future. I deserve, Clara said firmly, covering his hand with hers. to make my own choices, and I choose you, Nathan Morgan or Nathan Holloway or whoever you need to be. I choose the man who brings me wildflowers and fresh meat, who protects what matters and stands up to bullies." For a moment, they stood frozen, the kitchen warm around them while the winter wind howled outside. Then Nathan pulled her into his arms, and Clara let herself be held, feeling safer than she had in months despite the danger closing in around them. "I need to tell you something," Nathan said against her hair. "About claiming the ranch." Clara pulled back to look at him. "You've decided?" "I went to Cheyenne last week, found a lawyer who remembered my father, remembered me as a boy." His smile was rueful. "Turns out I can prove who I am, if I'm willing to face it all. The question is whether I should." "Of course you should." "Listen," Nathan interrupted gently. "If I claim the ranch, I inherit all of it, including my father's enemies, old debts, complications I don't even know about yet. And with the town turned against us," he stroked her cheek, "it might be safer for everyone if I let it go." "Safer, maybe," Clara admitted. "But right?" Before Nathan could answer, the night exploded with sound shouting, horses, the crash of breaking glass. They rushed to the window to see torches in the yard, riders circling the buildings. "Stay here," Nathan commanded, drawing his gun. But Clara was already reaching for the rifle Patterson had insisted she keep in the kitchen. "We face this together or not at all." They emerged into chaos. A mob from town had surrounded the ranch, some carrying torches, all armed. Sheriff Watson sat his horse at the front, his badge glinting in the firelight. "Nathan Holloway," he called out, "you're under arrest for cattle rustling and conspiracy." "You have no proof," Patterson shouted from the bunkhouse door. The ranch hands arranged behind him, armed but outnumbered. "We have testimony," Watson replied. "One of Bates's men turned state's evidence. Says Holloway was the inside man." Clara knew it was a lie, could see the satisfaction in the sheriff's face. This wasn't about justice. It was about removing an obstacle. "Then arrest me." Nathan stepped forward, hands visible but near his gun. "But leave the ranch and these people out of it." "Can't do that," Watson said with false regret. "Anyone harboring a criminal is equally guilty." The threat was clear. They would use Nathan as an excuse to clear the ranch, arrest anyone who stood in their way. Clara felt rage rise in her throat like bile. "Wait!" She stepped forward, her voice carrying across the yard. "Before you do something that can't be undone, there's something you should know." The mob quieted, curious despite themselves. Clara took a deep breath, knowing that what she said next would change everything. "Nathan Holloway is Nathan Morgan, Josiah Morgan's son and rightful heir to this ranch. He has proof, documents, witnesses." "You're not arresting a criminal. You're trying to run off the legal owner of the Rocking M." The silence that followed was deafening. Clara felt Nathan's hand find hers, squeezing tight, and she squeezed back. They would stand together, whatever came next. In the flickering torchlight, she saw calculation replace certainty on several faces. The game had changed, and everyone knew it. What happened next would determine not just Nathan's fate or hers, but the future of everyone who called the Rocking M home. The fire started in the early hours of a February morning, when the world was locked in the deepest cold of winter. Clara woke to the acrid smell of smoke and the sound of men shouting. She threw on her wrapper and boots, rushing outside to see the grain storage building engulfed in flames, orange tongues licking at the black sky. "Water Brigade," Patterson was bellowing, organizing the men into lines. "Save what you can," but they all knew it was hopeless. The building was too far gone. The winter had left the water barrels low, and the wind was pushing the flames toward the main barn. If that caught, they'd lose the horses, the tack, everything. Clara joined the bucket line, her hands soon numb from the cold water, her lungs burning from smoke. Beside her, Sam coughed heavily, his face black with soot. They worked with desperate efficiency, but the fire was winning. Then Nathan was there, appearing from the smoke like an apparition. He'd been staying at the ranch openly since Clara's revelation 3 weeks ago. fighting the legal battles by day and watching for trouble by night. Now he took in the situation with one quick glance. "Cut a fire break," he ordered. "Pull down the fence between the storage and the barn. Create a gap the fire can't jump." The men leaped to obey, Patterson adding his voice to Nathan's commands. They worked with frantic energy, tearing down posts and rails, clearing a strip of ground. Clara found herself beside Nathan, both of them beating at spot fires with wet blankets. "This wasn't an accident," Nathan said grimly, low enough that only she could hear. Clara had suspected the same. The legal proceedings had not been going well for those who wanted to seize the ranch. Nathan's claim, backed by documents and witness testimony, was solid. But if the ranch was destroyed, if they couldn't survive until spring, a burning timber crashed down nearby, showering them with sparks. Nathan pulled Clara against him, shielding her with his body as embers rained down. For a moment, pressed against his chest, she could hear his heartbeat racing to match her own. "Back to the waterline," he said roughly. Releasing her, they fought the fire until dawn revealed the damage. The grain storage was gone, taking with it most of their winter feed. The horses were saved. The barn still stood, but the loss was devastating. The men gathered in the kitchen, exhausted and disheartened. Clara made coffee with shaking hands, serving biscuits that tasted like ash in everyone's mouths. "How bad?" Nathan asked Patterson quietly. "We've got maybe 2 weeks of feed left if we ration hard." The foreman's face was grim. "Not enough to last until the grass comes in." "We could buy grain from town," Jake started. "With what money?" Patterson interrupted. "And who'd sell to us? You've seen how they look at us now." The silence was heavy with defeat. They'd survived rustlers and blizzards, but this slow strangling might finish them. "I'll sell some of the horses," Nathan said finally. "My father's breeding stock should bring good money, even in winter." "Those horses are the ranch's future," Patterson protested. "Your father spent 20 years building that bloodline. The ranch has no future if the cattle starve," Nathan replied flatly. Clara watched the exchange, her heart aching. She knew what those horses meant. They were Josiah Morgan's legacy, the one thing Nathan had seemed to take pride in when he'd finally claimed his inheritance. To sell them now was like selling pieces of his father's dream. Over the next days, they rebuilt what they could. The men worked with grim determination, but Clara could see the doubt in their eyes. Some had already started making quiet inquiries about work elsewhere. She couldn't blame them. Men with families couldn't afford to stay with a failing ranch. Nathan threw himself into the work with an intensity that worried her. He was up before dawn, working until well past dark, driving himself as if he could single-handedly save the ranch through sheer will. The legal battles continued 2 trips to town to file papers, meetings with the territorial officials who seemed determined to find any excuse to invalidate his claim. One evening, Clara found him in the barn, brushing down his father's prize stallion, a magnificent black horse named Tempest. Nathan's movements were slow, almost reverent, and Clara realized with a start that he was saying goodbye. "The buyer comes tomorrow," he said without turning. "Rancher from Colorado. He'll take good care of them." "Nathan, it's just horses. Clara." But his voice was rough with emotion he couldn't quite hide. She moved closer, placing a hand on his arm. "No, it's not. It's your father's life work. It's the boy who left wanting to prove himself, coming home to save what his father built." Nathan's hands stilled on the brush. "Sometimes I wonder if I'm saving it or just prolonging the inevitable. Maybe everyone would be better off if I'd never come back." "I wouldn't be," Clara said firmly. "Neither would Sam or Jake or any of the families depending on this place. You gave them hope. Nathan, you gave me hope." He turned to face her then, and the raw pain in his eyes made her heart clench. "What if I fail you? What if I can't save this place after all?" Clara reached up to cup his face, feeling the roughness of stubble against her palms. "Then we'll have tried. We'll have stood for something. That matters. Nathan, you matter." He caught her hands, holding them against his face as if drawing strength from her touch. "How did I survive so long without you?" "You were waiting," Clara said softly. "Just like I was, waiting to find where we belonged." Nathan pulled her into his arms, and they stood together in the barn while Tempest nickered softly in his stall. Outside, the winter wind howled, but here in the circle of Nathan's embrace, Clara felt warm and safe and home. The next morning brought two surprises. The first was a late winter storm that delayed the horse buyer. The second was Sam bursting into the kitchen with news that would change everything. "Fire wasn't set by who we thought," he gasped, still breathless from riding hard. Tom Williams was in town, heard them talking at the saloon. It was Whitman, the land commissioner. He's been taking bribes from the Eastern cattle companies, promising to deliver the ranch one way or another. Nathan's expression went deadly cold. "You're certain?" Tom heard him bragging, saying how the fire would finish us, force a sale. Sam's young face was bright with anger. Sheriff was there too, laughing about it. "Get Patterson," Nathan ordered, "and saddle the horses, all of them." Clara caught his arm. "What are you planning?" "To end this," Nathan said grimly, "one way or another." Within an hour, the entire ranch was mobilized. Nathan had sent riders to the neighboring ranches, the small operations that had watched the Rockingham's troubles with growing concern for their own futures. By noon, a small army had gathered in the yard. "They want to use fear and intimidation?" Nathan addressed the crowd from the porch. "Then let's show them what real solidarity looks like. We ride to town, peaceable but armed. We demand a territorial investigation of Whitman and anyone else involved in this corruption. And if they refuse," someone called out. Nathan's smile was sharp as winter wind. "Then we make it very clear that attacking one ranch means attacking all of us, that burning barns and corrupting officials will be met with united resistance." Clara watched from the doorway as the men prepared to ride. This was the Nathan who had been a marshal, decisive, commanding, dangerous when protecting what mattered. But she also saw the man who had held her in the barn, who understood loss and loneliness and the courage it took to try again. As he swung up on his horse, he caught her eye. The look they shared was full of understanding. This moment would decide everything. Either they would expose the corruption and save the ranch, or they would fail and lose it all. "Be careful," she called. "Always am," he replied, but his smile softened the words. "Keep the coffee hot. We'll be hungry when we get back." Clara watched them ride out, ranchers and cowboys, men who had set aside their differences to stand together against injustice. As the dust of their passage settled, she turned back to the kitchen where the women who had come to wait gathered around her table. "They'll succeed." "Mrs." Patterson said firmly, though worry creased her face. "They have to." Clara nodded, pouring coffee and setting out food for the anxious vigil ahead. But her thoughts were with Nathan, riding toward a confrontation that would determine not just the fate of a ranch, but the future of everyone who had found home beneath the wide Wyoming sky. The waiting was the hardest part. But Clara had learned patience in these mountains. She had learned that sometimes you had to fight for what mattered, that love could bloom in the harshest ground, and that broken things could be rebuilt stronger than before. Now, all that remained was to see if those lessons would be enough. Spring came to Wyoming like a cautious visitor, testing the air before fully committing to warmth. The snow retreated slowly up the mountains, revealing the green shoots beneath, and the world seemed to exhale after holding its breath all winter. Clara stood on the kitchen porch, watching the sunrise paint the peaks gold and rose, breathing in the sweet smell of new growth. 3 months had passed since Nathan and the ranchers had ridden to town in force. The confrontation had been tense but ultimately successful. Faced with united opposition and the threat of territorial investigation, Whitman had fled in the night, leaving behind enough evidence of his corruption to ensure he'd never hold office again. The sheriff, stripped of his badge, had followed soon after. The ranch had survived, scarred but standing. Nathan's ownership was now uncontested, recorded in legal documents that no corrupt official could challenge. More importantly, the unity forged in crisis had lasted. The neighboring ranches now worked together, sharing resources and labor, creating a community stronger than any individual operation. "You're up early," Nathan's voice came from behind her, warm with the intimacy of shared mornings. Clara leaned back against him as his arms circled her waist. "I wanted to see the sunrise. Every day it comes a little earlier, stays a little longer." Nathan pressed a kiss to her temple. "Speaking of staying longer, the preacher's coming through next week. If you were interested in making certain arrangements permanent." Clara turned in his arms, studying his face. The harsh lines had softened over the winter, the perpetual wariness replaced by something that might be called peace. "Is that your way of proposing, Mr. Morgan?" "I proposed properly last month," Nathan reminded her with a grin. "And the month before that, this is just me checking if you've changed your mind about making an honest man of me. As if you could ever be anything but honest." Clara laughed, but her eyes were bright with unshed tears. "Yes, Nathan, still yes, always yes." They stood together watching the ranch wake up cowboys emerging from the bunkhouse, horses calling for their morning feed, the eternal rhythm of life that had called Nathan home and given Clara a new beginning. Sam waved from the corral, grinning broadly, probably already planning the celebration he'd been threatening to throw. "I need to tell you something," Nathan said quietly. "Got a letter yesterday from the territorial governor. They want to offer me a position, deputy marshal for the district." Clara's heart skipped. "Nathan," I turned it down. He continued quickly. "That life is behind me. I've got everything I want right here. The ranch, the men who've become family, and you." He cupped her face gently. "Especially you. Are you sure?" Clara searched his eyes. "I don't want you to have regrets. The only thing I regret is the time I wasted running from this place," Nathan said firmly. "My father built something good here, something worth preserving. And now, with you beside me, we can build something even better." The breakfast bell rang, and soon the kitchen was full of hungry cowboys, their voices bright with plans for the day. The spring roundup was coming, calves to brand, fences to mend, all the endless work of ranch life. But the mood was different now. Hopeful, excited even. Patterson stopped by Clara's stove, his weathered face creased in a rare smile. "Good to see the place coming alive again. Mrs. Mitchell. Or should I practice calling you Mrs. Morgan?" "Not until the preacher makes it official," Clara replied, blushing as the men whooped and teased. "About time." Jake rumbled from his seat. "Been watching you two dance around each other all winter. Like watching paint dry." Miguel agreed with a grin. Slow and painful for everyone involved. The good-natured ribbing continued through breakfast, but Clara didn't mind. This was family, chosen and cherished, bound together by shared trials and common purpose. She'd come here seeking escape from grief, and had found so much more. Later that morning, she and Nathan walked up to the small cemetery on the hill overlooking the ranch. Josiah Morgan's grave stood solid and permanent, the headstone weathered but readable. Nathan had added fresh flowers, the wild flowers that were beginning to dot the meadows. "Think he would have approved?" Nathan asked quietly. "Of me coming back? Of you?" Clara slipped her hand into his. "I think he would have been proud. You saved his legacy, but more than that, you've honored it. The ranch isn't just surviving, it's thriving." "Because of you," Nathan said. "You brought life back to this place, made it a home again instead of just land and cattle." They stood in comfortable silence, the wind playing with Clara's hair, carrying the scent of sage and possibility. Below them, the ranch spread out like a map of their future, the buildings sturdy and well-maintained, the cattle growing fat on spring grass, the men working with purpose and pride. "I've been thinking," Clara said eventually, "about adding on to the house, a bigger kitchen, maybe a proper dining room for when the families come to visit." "Planning for the future?" Nathan smiled down at her. "Our future," Clara corrected. "The one we're building together." The week passed quickly in preparation. The women from neighboring ranches arrived to help Clara with her dress, a simple but elegant creation in cream-colored silk that Mrs. Patterson had been secretly working on. The men spent their evenings decorating the barn for the celebration, stringing lanterns and building tables for the feast Clara was planning. When the day arrived, it seemed the entire valley had turned out. The preacher, a traveling minister who'd married half the territory, performed the ceremony in the meadow where the wildflowers bloomed thickest. Nathan stood tall and proud in his best suit, his eyes never leaving Clara's face as she walked toward him on Patterson's arm. "Dearly beloved," the preacher began, his voice carrying across the assembled crowd. "We gather today to witness something precious, not just the joining of two hearts, but the continuation of a legacy, the building of a future on foundations laid by those who came before." Clara barely heard the words, lost in Nathan's gray eyes and the smile that transformed his weathered face. When he slipped the ring on her finger, a simple gold band that had been his mother's, she felt the circle of their story completing and beginning anew. "You may kiss your bride," the preacher announced, and the valley erupted in cheers as Nathan drew Clara into his arms. The celebration lasted well into the night. Tables groaned under the weight of food. Fiddles sang out dancing tunes, and laughter echoed off the mountains. Clara found a moment to slip away from the dancing, standing at the edge of the light to catch her breath. Nathan found her there, as she'd known he would. "No regrets?" he asked, pulling her against him. "None," Clara said firmly. "This is where I belong, where we belong." They stood together watching their guests, cowboys and ranchers, townspeople who'd come to accept Nathan's place among them, families that depended on the rocking M and the community growing around it. Sam was dancing with a schoolteacher from town. Jake was arm wrestling all comers, and Patterson was deep in conversation with other ranch foremen about the upcoming cattle drive. "You know what the best part is?" Nathan said softly. "What's that?" "Tomorrow, when all this settles down, you'll still be in that kitchen, making breakfast for the hands. I'll still be working the ranch, planning for the future. But now it's our kitchen, our ranch, our future." Clara turned in his arms, reaching up to touch his face. "She cooked for ranch hands," she quoted with a smile, never knowing the stranger owned the land in her heart. "Both freely given," Nathan murmured against her lips. "Both cherished beyond measure." As they kissed, the mountains stood witness to their promise, eternal and enduring. The Rocking M Ranch, which had seen so much struggle and sorrow, now rang with joy and hope. And in the kitchen where it all began, the fire burned warm and welcoming, ready for all the mornings to come. The stars wheeled overhead, the same stars that had watched over wagon trains and warriors, settlers and seekers, all those who'd come to this wild land looking for something they couldn't name until they found it. For Clara and Nathan, that search had ended where it began, in a kitchen, over coffee, two wounded souls finding healing in each other's hearts. And if sometimes the wind carried whispers of their story across the valley, of the widow who cooked with love and the stranger who protected from the shadows until love brought him into the light, well, that was just the way of the West, where legends were born from truth and happy endings were earned with courage, faith, and the willingness to risk everything for love. Thank you so much for listening to this Wild West love story. I hope Clara and Nathan's journey touched your heart as much as it did mine. Where are you listening from today? I'd love to hear from our listeners around the world. Drop a comment below and let's connect. Don't forget to subscribe to From Wild West channel for more authentic frontier romance stories. And please share your thoughts about this tale of love blooming in the Wyoming mountains. Your support means everything, and I can't wait to bring you another story next time. Happy trails, partners.